In Eugene Thacker's book, In the Dust of This Planet, he suggests that there are 3 levels to reality. He wrote that there is a world as it is for humans, or for us, there is a world that is out there beyond us, and there is a world as it is without us. Put differently, there is a world of our subjective experience, there is a world as it is objectively or as an object, and there is a world as it is not. There is a way the world becomes negative, unknowable, not just beyond us, but without us. The way the world negates us. If true, if the world can be conceived as ultimately negative, as a negation of all concepts, this might have some rather severe consequences. It could very well mean that the very notion of the world as it is for us, or even as it is in itself, should be tossed aside. Nothing is real. As Rusty Cole said in the television show True Detective, I think human consciousness is a tragic misstep in evolution. We became too self-aware. Nature created an aspect of nature separate from itself. We are creatures that should not exist by natural law. We are things that labor under the illusion of having a self, an accretion of sensory experiences and feelings programmed with total assurance that we are somebody. But, in fact, everybody is nobody. Put differently, we think we are the center of some world, the focal point of a meaningful existence, but we are instead only random, incoherent bits of noise, zipping from here to nowhere. However, the philosopher Slavoj Zizek isn't convinced by Thacker's assertion of the reality of pure negation because, and here's the tricky part, it ends up being too positive. Zizek illustrates this with the following joke from the film Ninotchka.
Here goes. When I first heard this joke, I laughed myself sick. Here goes. A man comes into a restaurant. He sits down at the table and he says, "Waiter, bring me a cup of coffee without cream." 5 minutes later, the waiter comes back and says, "I'm sorry, sir, we have no cream. Can it be without milk?" Sure. Not funny, huh? No.
Another way to understand the objection to Thacker's nihilism is to think about atheism. In ancient Rome, the early Christians were considered atheists because they didn't believe in the traditional Roman gods. Their religion without Jupiter or Neptune was considered purely negative by the Roman authorities. Or consider the nihilism of the incels. When they take the black pill, they aren't negating some abstract existence or meaning in itself as a pure positivity, but specifically, they are negating the dream of romance and love, the dream of having a fulfilling relationship with the opposite sex, like they learned about by watching television and listening to pop tunes. When you take the black pill today, you don't end up in some pure negativity. You don't find a realm of pure freedom, but rather you just give up on a particular idea within a particular society in a given moment. This is why people who take the black pill are so unhappy, so filled with resentment. They've only seemed to give up on the old dream. This pure negativity of the world without us turns out to be what a Marxist like Lukács would call a reification. Reification is when you take what is only an abstraction to be something that exists in the world, or in the case of Thacker, to be the world without us. The world without us is defined by our absence in the same way that an incel is defined by his lack of a girlfriend. And by removing us from the picture, it creates the idea of the human subject that is fixed, nearly singular, when the reality is that we are moving through redefinitions that arise from how we create and recreate the world. A world that is not without us, but that is for us and that acts through us. And this interactive or dialectic quality of our lives explains why we can't simply remove problems that we want to overcome. This is why the singular problem of poverty, for instance, can't be escaped from through a simple process of redistributing wealth. After all, the wealth that we create in the world relies upon inequality and needs that inequality as an incentive for production. This wealth also relies upon the exploitation of workers to create the value that sets up exchanges in the market. Another way to consider the problem of nihilism is to think about the most recent demand that's emerged from the streets and from liberal NGOs. Only we'll consider it through the looking glass.
This narrative takes place in an alternate universe. Any resemblance to fire departments in your universe is purely coincidental. This disclaimer does not apply to other departments. What's all the shit about the fire brigade? They're like the rest of us, they do their job and try to get paid. These accusations are entirely fake. It's best if we ignore them till they quietly fade. They've always had our best interest at heart. They save lives, that's how it's been since the start. They know what they're doing, they're consummate pros. Well, what's that coming out of that hose? It's an outrage. Yes, I'm turning about face. How strange is that when houses disappear without trace? It outweighs and slays my doubt, lays it out in front of me and downplays my devout faith. How do they keep getting away with this? I put one hand up and made a fist. We gotta break the tension, stop make pretending, take revenge and rage against the engine. Fuck, fire department coming by unannounced, just a prior apartment. If they can't find a fire, they're like, why don't we start them? I'm tired of arson, fuck the fire department. Fuck the fire department coming by unannounced, just a prior apartment. If they can't find a fire, they're like, why don't we start them? I'm tired of arson, fuck the fire department.
In Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, the fire department sets fires and burns books rather than putting fires out. Being a work of fiction, the reasons for this aren't clear, can't be tracked down or fully figured out. Ray Bradbury himself said that while some people have interpreted his book to be about the horror of the McCarthy era and the anti-communist hysteria that swept through America in the 50s, he considered his novel to be about something altogether different.
I wasn't worried about freedom, I was worried about people being turned into morons by TV.
But what Bradbury didn't realize was that television itself was a reflection of the demands of a changing society in the throes of capitalist development. Neither the proliferation of screens nor the conformity and the imagination that Bradbury feared and deplored could fully explain the world he created in his novel. Rather, the world of Bradbury's imagination wasn't one built on a simple analogy, but rather was a distorted version of urban modernity. Getting rid of the television screens in Bradbury's world wouldn't overcome the problem Bradbury was describing, any more than getting rid of the fire department would solve anything. After the murder of George Floyd, there's no one who can doubt that we need to reform or change the way the police function in society. Not even Trump. But we still have to think dialectically. Abolishing or defunding the police would leave too many other aspects around police violence. The inequality in wealth distribution, for instance. The fact that the total profits in our society are declining. The way that we are working in service of an abstract system rather than the other way around. The racist attitudes and history of those attitudes. It would leave all of that intact. The protests after the murder of George Floyd were neither purely negative, aimed only at destruction, nor were they reformist and aimed at making demands of the state. Rioters and looters were always, as Josh Clover pointed out in his book, riot, strike, riot, aiming to meet their practical needs. And as Guy Debord wrote in response to the Watts riots of 1965, the Los Angeles Rebellion was a rebellion against the commodity, against the world of the commodity in which worker consumers are hierarchically subordinated to commodity standards. Like the young delinquents of all advanced countries, but more radically, because they are part of a class without a future, a sector of the proletariat unable to believe in any significant chance of integration or promotion. The Los Angeles blacks take modern capitalist propaganda, its publicity of abundance, literally. While it might seem that the difficulty for the protesters is that, like any other nihilist who wants to destroy the meaning that binds him, they end up trapped by the very logic they set out against. In fact, their activity doesn't fall as short as many other one-sided actions. Taking place on the side of consumption and circulation alone, rather than taking up the realm of production, riots on this scale still manage to destabilize the world. And this destabilization does create opportunities, even as it risks creating a backlash and regression. Further, even efforts to address the productive side of capital often end up stuck in a cycle of reformist victories that then collapse due to the contradictions of the system. Once you recognize that nihilism can't overcome the authority that it is trying to escape, once you see that every atheism always relates to a dead God whose corpse must be dragged along in order to support the new disbelief, then a new problem emerges. How do we take a dead God and change him? In Hegelese, this is known as negating the negation. The best that I can offer are some half-baked scenarios on that front. That is, at this point I find myself ceasing to be political and verging towards surrealism or science fiction. I think about Arseny Avramov and his symphony of factory sirens, which he conceived of as a way to transform production into an art form for itself. Or I imagine transforming our work into MUDs, played in augmented reality. Just what to do to this world as it is, how to transform it, isn't something I can tell you. The question for now is, how do we gain the power to do so while holding this objective in mind? All I can say with confidence is that opportunities will come in multiple directions, and that in order to recognize them, we will have to move beyond any one-sided approach. For instance, even the deterioration of the relationship between the sexes and the temporary rise of an incel army filled with depressed young men who were convinced that they could never get laid required that we look beyond the obvious in order to take advantage or even just understand the problem. The key moving forward will be to think through the crisis, and by that I mean to refuse thought taboos and the demands for thoughtless solidarity for whatever damn position appears automatically. In the 1890s, there was a crisis in Marxism, a crisis that was spurred on by the failure of the proletariat to bring revolution to Europe, brought on a debate about whether Marx's theory of economic breakdown was true, or whether it might be possible to reform the parliamentary system in order to represent the interests of the working class. However, rather than debating the need for reform or revolution, we should today understand the question of breakdown differently. Namely, given the economic crises we've experienced in our lifetimes, the concentration of power into fewer and fewer hands, the expanded power of the surveillance state, and the collapse of the legitimacy of state authorities, we should ask ourselves if we want to continue to either be determined by the logic of capital or directed by a centralized authority. The task for would-be revolutionaries is to come together to think and experiment. Again, we can't just remove the police if we want to create a world without state-sanctioned violence. But we have to remove the system of power that the police are tasked with protecting. We can't overcome that power by refusing to play by the rules or by attacking it directly. Capitalism can't be burned down or beaten in a conventional war. just as there is no world without us that isn't colored by our self-conception. There is no post-capitalist world that won't be built upon capitalism itself. But what we've seen in the last 10 days is that the real power of this world as it is, the real motor force of history, is not the cops. The real power isn't Donald Trump or Joe Biden or the military. Rather, the power that gets the world to move and change is the power that we all have together. Last week, enough of us said no, and that set the world teetering. The next step is to figure out a way to say yes to something new. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.